it was one of those things that's like recommended to you on the side, where it's like, you know, if I were a smart Marine, I'd have an AK or something in my vehicle, just in case, you know, somebody accidentally gets killed, you know, I wouldn't get in trouble for it because, oh, well, it's obviously an insurgent, he has a weapon, so you're in the clear because you killed an insurgent.
When we arrived there, they gave us quite a few AKs, and they said, keep them in case something happens. And that was about it. It just went from chain of command down to us, and it actually was pretty much everybody on the base.
When mistakes were made, we carried drop weapons. These weapons right here were taken from the Iraqi police back during our first deployment. And this is just an example that we would take their weapons and carry them around with us in case we did mess up and shot the wrong person.
I've heard numerous circumstances of civilians getting killed, and then you know, soldiers and Marines subsequently placing weapons on their bodies or placing wire on them.
We would photograph all the people we killed, and in the photographs there would be the object, either the shovel or the AK-47, and that was proof enough to protect the individual soldiers from getting tried for any sort of crimes.
We hear of very few of the prosecutions that actually occur in Iraq and Afghanistan. But of those that have made the newspapers, I can think of 3 off the top of my head, which involved dropped weapon. So yes, it does happen, and it happens more frequently than we would like to believe, and certainly more frequently than we know.
You got a crew of 3 guys that use the same truck every single day. You know, you throw an AK-47 that you confiscate at a house in your truck, and you don't turn it in, you just keep it on that truck. The AK-47 is always there. It's not something that you have to be reminded of. It's just always in the truck. So if it happens, it's like, we're like, oh yeah, we got that AK-47.
It goes down through the ranks. That stuff spreads real quick. And there was definitely no discouragement from doing it. So, you know, it got done. I carried drop weapons.
I'm sorry?
I carried drop weapons myself, so.
Where would you carry them?
In our truck. I was actually in a 7-ton truck, so there was plenty of space there. And we had so much gear and stuff crammed in there already. You know, it's not hard to stick it in there.
How serious of an offense is it? I assume that it's essentially a criminal cover-up.
Premeditated murder is a possible charge. Obstruction of justice is another. Conspiracy, if there's more than one individual. Conspiracy to murder, conspiracy to obstruct justice. If you lie to the NCIS or whoever the investigator is, Army CID, then you have a false official statement as well. So there's a cascade effect from the single act of dropping that weapon.
It almost made sense, like it was common sense, like you have to carry a drop weapon unless you want to go to prison for killing an Iraqi. You know, it's not that we wanted to go out there and kill a bunch of innocent Iraqis, but because of the nature of what was going on, it was almost guaranteed that it was going to happen, you know. So, like, it was a natural step to hear drop weapons and all that. Like, it made sense.
You take a commander, he's in charge of all these young men, and it's his responsibility to get them home safe. You know, what's going to look worse on him? Losing a soldier and having to go tell his mother that he just died? Or having some Iraqi that you can just throw in a dumpster or throw over a wall or hide under some brush or throwing a drop weapon on and say he was an enemy combatant, let's move out? I absolutely heard superior officers and higher ranking officials talking about this stuff, you know? I'm not talking about, like, sergeant, you know, so-and-so, or, you know, lieutenant so-and-so. I'm talking, like, majors and,
You know, you got a lieutenant colonel talking to, you know, the sergeant major of the battalion, and it's like they're talking about this stuff openly. You're like, yeah, it's against the rules, but you got to cover your ass somehow.
Individuals don't want to have to deal with a wrongful death, don't want to have to deal with a murder. I mean, if the troops go out and kill somebody and CID has to be brought in, and suddenly you're being investigated for your performance in training your troops and then in reporting or not reporting what you knew or should have known, then this presents serious problems for the commander. And commanders may, some weaker commanders may be willing to even encourage this.
The whole point of the drop weapons is you don't tell anyone. Because the second that word is even mentioned, you're going to get burned. You're going to get fried for it. You know, and that's well known. But it's also encouraged that you do carry them just in case. It's just one of those ugly little things that they like to keep on the down low, you know?
Isn't it something that they should be speaking out actively against?
I think there's no question that seniors in the chain of command, they know about dropped weapons. They know that it goes on. When you're talking about platoon commanders and company commanders who are closest to the actual troops, of course they know about it in detail. As you go up the chain of command all the way to a four-star general, I have no doubt that the most senior officers in Iraq and Afghanistan, all the way up to General Petraeus, are aware of it. But what are they to do? As long as you put high-power weapons in the hands of 18 and 19-year-olds, bad stuff's going to happen once in a while. And the best we can do is aggressively prosecute those cases that we become aware of.
Everything we did there, when we were there, it didn't seem wrong. Everything was right because people that we charge with, people that we trust, and people that we have to take care of us, they tell us it's fine because they give us the rules of engagement and they do it. And we just, unfortunately, we're young and our brains are innocent and they control it. And when you tell a 19, 20-year-old kid that just, you know, sees his friends get killed and things blowing up all the time, he don't care. If you tell him this, he'll do it.
When you know something is wrong, but you feel like you have to do it if you want to survive and you want to go home to your family, it's almost like you're being put in a place where you have no choice except to be dishonest. And I think that's a difficult burden to place on people. I don't think it should be placed on people. I don't think that's right.
The American public just doesn't know what's going on, and the American public doesn't care. Unless they've got a son, brother, husband, wife, sister over there, they just don't care. It doesn't touch them. And that's not necessarily their fault. I think it's our leadership's fault.
I am certain that drop weapons are still getting used today. Things are still going on the way they were then. It's still getting used, I guarantee it.
The mission of Breaking the Silence.
So Breaking the Silence started as an organization in March 2004 by a group of soldiers that served in Hebron, which is one of the biggest cities in the West Bank, south of Jerusalem, during the peak of the Second Intifada. 22 Israelis killed in Hebron, out of them a 10-month-old baby in Shalhevet Pas. 88 Palestinians were killed. 64 of them were not involved in any violence or any actions against the army or the settlers, and 2 of them were actually killed by settlers themselves, a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old. Now this is what they were going through, and in this 1 year, even people that were totally with the mission, no questions, they realized that there's this crazy gap between what they're doing inside the army, day in and day out, and what their family, friends, communities know about back home. And this gap, or this silence, started to affect them, and they said, look, there's something is going on here. I mean, we're experiencing these things during our service, but we're coming home. We can't bring this home to our family's dinner table. And eventually, after finishing their 3 years of service with questions, with thoughts, with discussions, they decided to put together an exhibition of pictures, of photos, of testimonies, very spontaneous, very not sophisticated, or very low tech, and they thought this could start some sort of debate inside the Israeli society. Now this debate actually was much wider than they expected, and thousands of people came to this very simple exhibition. They were also invited to show it in the Knesset, in the parliament, which today is unheard of, with probably one of the most right-wing governments we ever had. But maybe the most important thing that happened is that people from different units, different places, different times, came out and said, we can tell you the exact same story. And the story is not only a specific unit in Hebron in 2002, but the story is paratroopers in 2000 in Nablus, or Golani, which is another infantry brigade, in 2003 in Bethlehem. And they realized this isn't the specific story of a specific unit, but the story of a generation. I served from November 2004 till 2007. What we do today in the organization is we focus on three major things. The first, the heart of our work, is gathering testimonies, having the information brought to the public, that we can have a real debate about what is happening and what is the moral price we're paying for controlling 4 million people. We do educational work, bringing people to tours in Hebron or in the South Hebron Hills using our testimonies. And the third part of our work is lobby work, because we understand that it can't only stay within the realm of a very specific group or community, but the idea is to increase resistance to the occupation. And increased resistance to the occupation has to also go through political levels, also with the help of journalists, and this isn't only something that could stay or change with doing only educational work.
So what's the sort of experience while serving that actually gets a soldier to take what's quite a big step to speak out against the Israeli armed forces?
My dad was a paratrooper. I'm named after a paratrooper that was killed in the Yom Kippur War, 1973. This is an important, it's not something that starts when you enlist in the army, right? It's actually Israel, if you'd like it or not, especially not all communities, but big parts of the communities are very militaristic. I mean, it's part of our society, it's part of our community. In the communities that do join the army, and not everyone joins the army, but in the communities that do join the army, it's very clear that this is your next step after high school. So when I turned 18, I did the year of community service, but after that year I joined the army, I went to the paratroopers. I felt that I'm continuing my family heritage, or what I was supposed to do. And I have to say that I did enter the army with questions, but maybe not the right questions, maybe not all the questions, but I did feel that I'm like a good Jew. This is what I was told in yeshiva. You have to walk around with question marks around your head. So I think I went into the army feeling I have the question marks. And the question marks is, how will I be a good soldier in a shitty situation? How will I be a good soldier in a bad situation? And I thought I could be that soldier standing in a checkpoint and smiling while cars passing by. Or I could enter a house but walk around with candies in my pockets and conduct a moral occupation, right? Which took me a while, but I realized this is a contradiction in terms. And when we started actually doing our actual service after almost a year, a couple of months of training, we started entering houses on a nightly basis, and searching houses on a nightly basis, or going in to arrest people in the middle of the night. You realize that it's impossible to be moral in an immoral situation. And I think this is something that's extremely difficult for us to explain. I mean, we've been touring the States for 3 weeks, and we came here to Australia with the book, which is called Our Harsh Logic. And I think the best understanding of what this harsh logic is, understanding what the soldier is going through in his mindset. And as a soldier, you rationalize situations. Now, your mission is to enter a house, because this is what you were asked to do. It doesn't matter how how big your smile will be to the family, you're disrupting their day-to-day life. And when the orders we got were instill the sense of of fear, or to instill a sense of someone is chasing you, or to brand the consciousness of Palestinians, or like I said before, to disrupt the day-to-day life of Palestinians' population, this is what it looks like. And there's no way to do it nicely.
It's a further step. Behaviors like systematic humiliation, even reaching to assault and torture.
There's many ways I can approach this, but I think it's important to understand the three kinds of testimonies we gather. The two extreme kinds of testimonies we gather. One extreme is what we all refer to as extreme cases, right? What beating up, stealing, humiliating, taking pictures with dead bodies, or taking pictures with tied up Palestinians. We all know this happens. There's footage of this, there's discussions of this. How most Israelis deal with this is they find a scapegoat. They say it's the soldier's fault, specifically him. What you have to do is enforce the law even harder on the soldiers. This is if you think it's a problem. There's many people that some of the incidents we're only talking about the people that find this as a problem. The other kind of testimony are illegal things that happen. For example, using a human shield. Happened in the West Bank in 2003. There was a Palestinian that was killed after soldiers entered the house, used him as a human shield. He was injured and killed. And the Supreme Court decided this was illegal. We have testimonies of soldiers doing this in 2005, in 2006, and so on and so forth. 2009, there was a very famous case in Operation Cast Lead of using a human shield. Illegal, right? Shooting white phosphorus, and so on and so forth. Also, the illegal things, when people find that they're a problem, also a lot of people don't think they're even a problem, right? But people who find them problematic will say, well, it's illegal, it's very clear what you have to send them to jail. But the heart of the testimony, right, the ground of how these actions are growing is the day-to-day life, is the routine, are the things that no one questions, right? For example, entering a house for military purposes, what is called a straw widow. I took part in numerous straw widows. This is something that happens around the West Bank, not really questioned, not considered illegal, not considered extreme. But when you have the order to enter a house and eventually do whatever you like in the house because you need it for military purposes, it's a very slippery slope. Because when you enter a house and only use it for an observation point, what do you do when your water is finished? And there's no other way to get water to you. Do you drink water or you don't drink water? What happens if your food finishes? Right? So when we're sitting here very comfortably, we say, of course, it's immoral to take someone's water or food without permission. Even though it's very easy to get permission when you have a helmet and gun, right? No one will say no to you. But this doesn't end. Like what happens if you have to take a shower in the house, and if you're in the house suddenly for 48 hours or 3 days, and if you're allowed to sit on the sofa, allowed to put your legs on the table. The thing is that it's extremely easy to sterilize the discussion, right? And say, well, it's very clear, it's either this or that. But the truth of the matter is, when you're standing in a checkpoint, you can be nice for the first hour. But after 4 hours of being hungry and hot or cold and pissed off, and the only way you can actually control people is by force, that's what you're going to do. And it's not a chance that we see the same testimonies coming up in the beginning of the Second Intifada, in the middle of the past decade, and yesterday, or tonight. We'll go see what's happening in the West Bank. We'll see similar stories.
I mean, is there any kind of de facto or maybe even officially sanctioned or promoted racist culture that acts as a justifying or or motivating force? Is this part of the reality of Israeli occupation?
Listen, it has to be part. It has to be part. In order to understand what is happening in the occupation, and this is where there is a difference between what's happening in the rest of Israel, is in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, everything, of course, is under Israeli control in the wider sense. There's a difference between Israel's control in the West Bank and Israel's control in Gaza, but we are still controlling both pieces of land. The law there, and it doesn't matter what your politics are, is a different law than the rest of Israel. Right? We're talking about one area that has civilian law, right, where people have the right to vote, where people have a political power, where people can go out to the street and demonstrate, and it's legal. In the West Bank, it's army law, it's martial law, and it's not by the people for the people, it's by Israel for Israel. Now, of course, this is every occupation, this isn't new. But two important things we have to remember. First of all, is this has been going on for 45 years. And as we see on the ground, and this is part of what we're trying to show with the book, there's no exit strategy. We're working on the ground with no end in sight. The second thing is, we started for different reasons, ideological reasons, security reasons, some people would say, to mobilize Jewish communities from Israel into the West Bank. And when we started to mobilize them, we created a situation that de facto there is never a possibility for equality. Because you're talking about 350, together with East Jerusalem, 500,000 Jewish settlers that are under Israeli civilian law. And 2.5 million Palestinians that are under army law, under martial law. Right? They'll never be equal. If you have two people meeting in the heart of Hebron, both in the same exact moment pick up a rock and throw it at each other, but one is Palestinian and one is Israeli, the Israeli would be tried under civilian law. Right? The Palestinian would be tried as a terrorist, doing the exact same thing. Now we can go on and give more examples with mistreating of children, right? Which a Palestinian child will not be treated the same as an Israeli child because there's a different law. That's where we understand that there'll never be equality, and there will always be, you could call it racism, and I think this is part of the story. And the bottom line, there's the idea of differentiating between two populations is part of the story, and part of what we talk about in the book that I'm here to promote is the idea of separation. This is the second chapter of the book. Most people really think that we're spending most of our time separating Israelis from Palestinians, but that's only part of what we're doing. They're already separated by law, but we're also doing another thing, which is separating Palestinians from Palestinians. And that's actually what we're spending most of our time doing. And this idea of separation is already implemented on the ground. When we actually broke down what we see the occupation is into four pillars, right? The occupation is a chair, the four legs of the chair, where these are actually terms that most soldiers know about, and actually even most Israelis know about, but they're referred to in a positive connotation. The first one is prevention, right? You prevent something bad from happening to someone good, can be bad. Separation, like I mentioned, most of the international community is talking about a two-state solution. That's separation. Isn't initially evil, right? We can debate if it's the right solution or not, but the third is fabric of life, allowing the Palestinians to maintain their fabric of life. Sounds excellent. And law enforcement. And what we try to do in the book is actually to break that down and to discover what these terms actually mean. In Hebrew, the word prevention means sikul. When you tell an Israeli sikul, the first thing that comes to mind is sikul memukad, targeted prevention, which is the best way to translate that, or targeted killing, assassinations. You have a ticking bomb scenario, Palestinians strapped with a bomb to him, leaving a big Palestinian city to a major Israeli city. It isn't new. This happened during the Second Intifada. I remember, being scared driving on buses in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. This is something that we remember, and we have to stop this ticking bomb scenario. And we use this tool, which is called targeted killing, assassinations. This, I think, most of Israelis will agree is something we have to do. But This already went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, you can use this tool as targeted assassinations only in the case of a ticking bomb scenario. But this is only the tip of this idea. We actually made it wider and wider and wider. And we continued on using this tool of targeted assassinations and killing people that aren't a ticking bomb scenario, but could be involved in violence, could be involved with what Israel sees as terror against Israelis or settlements, and are definitely people that Israel could arrest, but we couldn't get our hands on them, so we assassinate them. Right? This is taking us the next level down, of course, with no trial, but it doesn't end there. Right? We also assassinate people for different reasons, political reasons. It's happened in Gaza many times. And the widest idea of this idea of prevention, or targeted prevention, is actually revenge killings. And we know about a dozen revenge killings. One of the famous ones is in February 19th, 2002. In a checkpoint near Ramallah called Ein Arik, 6 Israeli soldiers were killed by Palestinians. The next night, 3 different units were launched to 3 different places, 2 in the West Bank, 1 in Gaza. The orders they got: this is a revenge attack. Everyone standing in a checkpoint at a specific time at night, you shoot to kill. At the end of the night, 15 Palestinian policemen were found dead. Now, this isn't a local officer's decision. This is at least the chief of staff, if not higher. There was a piece in one of the Israeli newspapers talking about this. But this is only one example of the idea of prevention. And we managed to take this very tip of idea of prevention, for example, arrests, make it wider and wider. So we first arrest the people we thought we have to arrest, and we arrest their neighbors or their cousins, and then we have mass arrests, right? Arresting everyone between 18 and 35. But the biggest idea of prevention that affects every Palestinian is what we call having our presence felt. And how do you have your presence felt? You're there every minute. Every Palestinian, doesn't matter what he's involved in, doesn't matter what he does for a living, he has to know you're right here. When we talk about entering houses, besides the fact that we're using the houses as military outposts, this is another way to have our presence felt. It's another way to show that we're always there.
Well, another pillar is separation, and of late more and more commentators, some of whom Israeli commentators, have said, this is the same idea as apartheid, separation, apartheid, separate. What's your comment on that?
Well, I didn't live in South Africa under apartheid. I don't know what it really looks like. I read about it in books. What I know and what we're experts in is the Israeli occupation. Now, I can't say I don't have the legal background. I don't have the historical background to say if legally this is what it is or if it isn't. What I can say is this is what it looks like, and this looks very bad. When we talk about the idea of separation, this is definitely part of what is happening in the West Bank today. I think that focusing and trying to find out if this is apartheid or isn't apartheid is pushing us away from the real issue, which is this is occupation, this is what it looks like, this is what it means to be a soldier that's conducting occupation, this is what it means to be a Palestinian living under occupation. Let's deal with that. When we talk about separation, one of the cities that we deal with, that we're in almost 4 times a week, is a city called Hebron, which I mentioned. And in the heart of Hebron, we're actually separating Israelis from Palestinians. Besides the fact that we separated both sides of the city, the Israeli part, there's still 30,000 Palestinians and 700 Jewish settlers. And the heart of the city, right, what used to be the biggest market in Hebron, is actually a road which is a sterile road. Which means Palestinians are not allowed to walk on this road. There's actually people living in the houses on top of this road. Used to be 30 families, now only 5 are left. But they can't even leave the front door of their house. Now, in my perspective, not only that this has nothing to do with the Israel that I want to be proud of, this has nothing to do with the Judaism I believe in, and this has nothing to do with taking us towards a solution. Now, the answer to what my claims are could be, well, this is security. And what can you do for security? This is what you have to do. The last Israeli killed in Hebron was in 2003. Right? The peak of the Second Intifada, which I mentioned earlier, was a very difficult time, to say the least. both for Israelis and for Palestinians. And maybe the idea then was, okay, let's separate the two communities. Of course, we have to remember that the idea of separation started with Goldstein's massacre in 1994. We won't get into that, but it wasn't only the separation didn't start with Palestinian violence in Hebron. It actually started with Jewish terror and Jewish violence, which is important to say. But when we talk about what is happening today in Hebron, October 2012, or almost 2013, almost 10 years after the last Israeli killed in Hebron, we're still talking about 1,800 stores shut down on military orders. We're talking about 70% unemployment. We're talking about Palestinians not being allowed to walk on some streets, drive in some streets, or open stores in streets. And we're actually pushing them into a different part of the city, which theoretically, again, could be legitimate if we're saying you could live there and we could live here. But what we're seeing all over the West Bank, and Hebron is only a microcosm of that, is that we're slowly pushing Palestinians into smaller areas, what is called Area A and Area B, which are together less than 40% of the West Bank. Okay? So it doesn't matter what our viewers or what your opinions are, if we should have a one-state or a two-state, but any sort of solution regarding this, regarding or that will bring us to end the occupation, has to acknowledge the fact that we can't allow more illegal outposts to be built while pushing Palestinians out of Area C. It's the biggest part of the West Bank, more than 64%, and we're actually slowly but surely making sure there won't be Palestinians there and de facto annexing the land.
I grew up on the south side of Chicago. My family are all union members, labor activists, steel workers, railroad workers, pipe fitters, iron workers. So I grew up in that background. My great-grandfather was in the Little Steel Strike of 1937, where they had 6 people who were murdered. And so that sort of educational background was very prevalent in my own upbringing. He often told the story growing up that he had a Chicago police officer stick a pistol in his mouth and ask him if he was a communist. And so with that background, my dad became somewhat radicalized as well, organized in the labor movement, mainly with Local 1, which is the main local of iron workers in Chicago. He was in the Army during Vietnam. He got out, became an activist. In 1968, he was in Grant Park in Chicago. It was a particularly brutal portion of American history, not to mention the fact that the FBI and many of the governmental organizations at that time had cracked down on the Black Panthers, the American Indian movement, and also the Vietnam veterans against the war. A big portion of the anti-war history that's been forgotten in America had been the impact that the anti-war veterans had. And in 1971, there was over 35,000 members of Vietnam veterans against the war. There were major actions taking place not only back home on military installations in the United States, but also servicemen and women who were taking it upon themselves to refuse combat orders while in Vietnam, and or many of whom decided to, what we call frag their commanders, kill people who were in their higher command, refuse orders. By 1971, there had been a major race riot on every single military installation in Vietnam. So the armed forces, by the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, were quite literally falling apart. That being said, with that background, I joined the military even though my father had warned me not to join, particularly in light of 9/11. I was a senior in high school, so we watched 9/11 happen on TV. The climate and the atmosphere in the United States at that point was very scary. There was a lot of jingoism, a lot of racism. The general attitude towards those from the Middle East, Muslims, Arabs, and so forth, was very rigid and was very radical. It was very toxic. To some degree, I think I sort of felt like that wasn't a duty to go. But I did feel as though I wanted to be a part of what was happening at that time. And I think in a very ignorant way, being a 17-year-old kid who thought he knew everything, I joined the Marine Corps. I joined as an infantryman and a machine gunner. I finished my School of Infantry training a month before the initial invasion of Baghdad in 2003. And so I was in Iraq during that portion. And during the second deployment in Al-Qaim, which is in the Al-Anbar province of Iraq, about 5 miles south of the Euphrates and about 2 miles east of the Syrian border. We spent most of our time patrolling, doing house raids, prisoner detention, things of this nature. And during that part of my experience is when I became, I think, a little more self-conscious of what was happening. Many of the people in Iraq that we were occupying had told us that obviously they didn't want us in their country anymore. They didn't want us there to begin with. And the American forces were conducting some very brutal actions. Most of the prisoners we took in were tortured. There was a lot of shooting of civilians, a lot of massacring of civilians, a lot of things that weren't on the daily news or the nightly news in America. And through those processes, I decided individually that I was no longer for the war, that I could no longer support the war effort. So when we rotated back to the States, they had told me that they were going to send me on a third deployment to Iraq, and I refused to go. At that point, my command administratively discharged me from the Marine Corps. After that happened, I came home and found out about an organization called Iraq Veterans Against the War, which is made up of servicemen and women who've served since 9/11 and are opposed to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have 4 very basic principles for the organization. 1 and 2 is immediate withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan. 3 is reparations for the people of Iraq and Afghanistan for the destruction and death caused for the last 10 years, if not, of course, as many of you know, through the sanctions in the 1990s, hundreds of thousands killed in Iraq. In the 1980s, of course, our support of various militant groups within Afghanistan. Those are our basic principles, and also full benefits in medical care for returning servicemen and women who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan. With that, we've been organizing around the United States with the anti-war movement, and the anti-war movement in the United States was, I think, quite potent and quite powerful and large in numbers. However, I think our inability to create political power to stop Bush in particular and the Republicans was sort of filtered into the Obama election in 2008. So a lot of what happened was this, sort of upwelling and swelling of support and organizing that was then filtered into this electoral process. During that time, and since then, it's been extremely difficult to get the anti-war movement up and rolling again in the United States. I should also add sort of a caveat to that. When the financial collapse took place in September, October of 2008 in the United States, that shifted most people's attention to economic issues, home foreclosures, things like this. And it's been very difficult, I think, for a lot of folks to make the connection between military spending and military empire and imperialism abroad, and the fact that at home we're having schools fall apart and roads are falling apart and labor unions are under attack and so on and so forth. And so throughout that period and still till today, we've been organizing on active duty bases around the United States. We have 4 different bases that have Iraq Veterans Against the War chapters on the base in the United States. We've set up coffee houses and GI magazines that are sort of resistance anti-war magazines that we publish on university campuses, and then also on cafes and so forth that we have set up outside of the active duty military installations. But it's also been very difficult to organize in that capacity because it's an all-voluntary force. It's much different than it was during Vietnam with the draft. And during Vietnam, you had hundreds of thousands of people who wouldn't have otherwise had served or joined to serve. And right now, with the economic situation in the United States, it's very difficult to ask young men and women not to join the service because the service in the United States provides free education and free health care. For folks in the United States, healthcare costs are absolutely ridiculous. As many of you know, we have over 60 million people who are uninsured and can't find health insurance that's affordable. Half of all bankruptcies in the United States are due to healthcare costs. So you have a segment of society, particularly from the African American and the Latin American communities, who feel as if their only way out is to join the service. And as I'm sure most of you know as well, in the United States, most students are now tens of thousands of dollars, if not well over $100,000 in debt from student loans. So that's the situation in terms of trying to, I think, persuade young folks in the United States to not join the services. We don't have a lot of other options right now. And the economy is such to where, you know, to ask someone to go work for $7.25 an hour, which is our minimum wage, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. The problems with returning servicemen and women, we have well over 150,000 veterans who are homeless in the United States. Close to 1/4 to 1/5 of the homeless population in the United States is made up of veterans. 1/10 of our prison population, which as many of you know is the largest in the world at 2.5 million prisoners, 1/10 of those are servicemen and women. 1/3 to 1/4 of all females who are getting out of the service are reporting military sexual trauma or rape. So 1/3 of women who are serving in the armed forces are being sexually assaulted or raped by their fellow servicemen and women. Not to mention, we have 18 veterans a day who are killing themselves. We've had more veterans commit suicide in the last 5 years than have died in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's been well over 6,000 veterans who've committed suicide just in the last 6 years. The unemployment rate for veterans right now hovers around 20%. For African American and Latin American veterans, that number jumps to about 30 to 40%. So all of the same sort of disparities that you find in American society, where the black and brown communities are far more impoverished than the white communities are, except for rural white communities. You have a situation where also when they're coming home as veterans, they're going back to that same socioeconomic community that they're coming from. The difficulties and the challenges are much different depending on the demographics with the veterans. So for instance, Latin American and African American veterans only make up 26% of the armed forces, but they make up 56% of the homeless population amongst those in the armed forces. So in a lot of ways, the military and what's happened with veterans is sort of a microcosm of what's happening in American society as a whole. All of that being said, we're dealing with an extremely traumatized community of veterans, many of whom, myself included, have been on multiple tours of duty. The folks that I work with oftentimes had served 3, 4, 5, 6 different times in Iraq or Afghanistan. And once someone comes home from something like that, they are forever changed. And it's something that we don't talk about in American society. We have this very sort of chest-beating patriotism when we want to go to war or when we promote the military or encourage people to join the service, but then when these veterans are coming home, of course, there's no services and they're cutting the budget for the Veterans Administration, which is sort of the overarching medical institution that takes care of veterans when they get home. So to move away from all of that negative information, we have found that in the last 5 years, particularly since the financial collapse, there's been an upsurge of activism in the United States. Okay, so we have the Occupy movement, we have several labor organizations and labor unions who have been now organizing, I think, more in a, I would say, radical way than they have in the past. It's been very difficult in the United States, especially since 1980, and of course the Thatcher and Reagan revolutions have absolutely destroyed the labor movement in the United States. Right now, only 11.7% of our workforce is unionized. So that's been a big issue. We've been working with veterans and the labor movement since then, trying to connect the issues of austerity with a military budget that, if you include nuclear weapons and if you include veterans' health care, hovers around $1 trillion a year in the United States. So as I think most of you know as well, the United States spends on its military what the rest of the world spends combined. That's something that still is very difficult to talk about in American society because there's millions of jobs that are tied to the military-industrial complex. And so now you have a situation where the economy is tanked, people want jobs, people know that the wars are bad, but now they don't know what to do. So there's the paradox with regards to military spending, at least one of the paradoxes. I will say that someone in the room had mentioned Bradley Manning earlier. There are a lot of actions and support for Bradley Manning amongst servicemen and women in our organization and also organizations like Veterans for Peace. Right now we have about 3,000 members in Iraq Veterans Against the War. We have chapters in every state in the United States, and then as I had mentioned, we also have chapters on active duty basis as well. And each chapter operates in a very autonomous fashion. So folks in San Francisco, for example, are working on mainly issues surrounding Bradley Manning, whereas the chapter in Chicago, where I'm from, we've been starting a campaign with the local nurses union in order to have the VA hospitals better staffed and better manned and funded and so on and so forth. And not to mention the folks who are working in the Veterans Administration hospitals are being asked to work ridiculous hours for low pay. Many of the nurses aren't even trained to deal with people who have PTSD. And the answer from the United States government and from the VA has been to shell out pills to everybody. So right now, for example, in Afghanistan, 17% of those who are in the combat zone are currently on psychotropic medications. About 1/5 of those who are serving in Iraq are on some kind of antidepressant, sleeping pill, anti-anxiety pill. When I came home from Iraq, their answer was to give me sleeping pills, antidepressant pills, anti-anxiety medication, and then in the morning a speeder so I could sort of get up and do stuff during the day, and then halfway through the day anxiety pills, antidepressant pills, and then sleeping pills at night to go to sleep. I eventually refused that treatment as well. I found that smoking a joint works a lot better for me. Okay, on a positive side, I've been mentioning all these negative things. That is something that has actually had a lot of support amongst the veterans community in the United States, is the legalization of marijuana. Now, I know usually that's talked about in this sort of boutique cultural activist way, oh, it's nice to just have weed legalized, but for millions of veterans who are coming home, it's a much different story, because instead of being pumped with tons of psychotropic medications, a lot of veterans have now taken it upon themselves to join the campaigns for the legalization of marijuana, or at least for medical use. And now the VAs in several states within the United States are allowing veterans to take that as medication. They won't prescribe it, but they won't get you in trouble if you have to take a urine test or something like this, a drug test. I was just mentioning the Occupy movement. Most of what we've done in the last 2 years has either happened in conjunction with the Occupy movement or in conjunction with the labor movement. So I was mentioning to Nick that I had been not only in Zuccotti Park in New York when the Occupy movement started, but then also we were in Madison, Wisconsin. And that was a very powerful experience. There's 115,000, 120,000 people who literally occupied the Capitol building in Madison, Wisconsin, and we felt like it was our building for 2 weeks. I must say that was probably one of the more empowering experiences I've ever had. However, as I mentioned with the 2008 election, a lot of what happens with American activism is that unfortunately it's then sucked into the electoral process. And so in Madison, instead of sort of sticking to the ground and staying with sort of grassroots organizing, resistance, direct action, strikes, that was filtered into a recall campaign for Wisconsin's governor, Scott Walker. So the Democrats and the large unions in the United States sometimes operate particularly in a non-progressive fashion, especially the major labor unions, many of whom we call sort of business unionism. It's not really tied to social justice activism. It's not really tied to social justice at all. It's more of this idea of how much money can we make per hour, and do we have benefits, and is our union taken care of? And as long as our union's taken care of, then the rest of the working class can kind of go away. But there are also progressive elements within the labor movement who have started to take leadership roles. So I do see positive elements there. Right now in the United States, one of the bigger actions and that we're trying to connect as well is obviously global warming and the environmental crisis. Talking about this in the United States is very difficult because, of course, right now with the tar sands pipeline, I think that's providing jobs for people at a time, again, when the United States economically is hurting. And it's the same with natural gas, fracking. But what these communities are finding out is that in the short term, they're getting jobs, but in the long term, their groundwater is destroyed, their soil is destroyed, their natural environment is destroyed, and some of it is irreparable damage. There are folks organizing around those issues in a very serious way. 350.org just held the biggest climate protest that we've had in the United States. There's close to 50,000 people there. But again, we're stuck with two political parties. So the difficulty in the electoral process is trying to find a way to gain power and make those decisions on a national level. Whereas locally in states like Vermont, we have socialists and Green Party folks and communists, but it's very marginalized to sort of geographical regions within the United States. Vermont being one. Another one would be, of course, San Francisco, Northern California, Oregon, Washington, where there's a lot of very radical environmental actions happening. Direct actions. There's environmental groups that are blowing up fracking sites right now. So those kinds of things are happening. There are organizations that are, I think, supportive of that. But again, it's a very small minority. And the problem with those actions right now is that we have, because of the economy, many people who are workers, part of the working class, who feel like this is an attack on their way of making a living and so forth. So it's been very difficult to build those broad coalitions at a time when people just want a job. With all that being said, I also do a weekly radio program. So in the community, it has sort of a 60-mile radius. We have a few thousand people who listen every week, and I interview anyone from activists to organizers to intellectuals on the left. So we routinely have folks like Vandana Shiva on the program, and David Harvey and Noam Chomsky and all those sorts of folks come on the program. So it's really neat. It gives me an opportunity and a platform to sort of not only try and educate folks, but the flip side to this is also how do we tie folks into doing work on the ground. So for the first hour of the program, I'll usually interview a left intellectual, and then in the second hour of the program, I'll usually interview activists and organizers, people who are on the ground doing this sort of work. With all of that, I came to Australia because I was able to be a part of a documentary film called On the Bridge. It's a film that follows 7 returning servicemen and women and a family whose son had committed suicide when he returned home. That film was accepted to the Big Picture Film Festival here in Sydney, which I guess is the first film festival that focuses strictly on social justice issues. I guess that's ever happened in Sydney, from what I've been told from the festival organizers. I just really wanted to meet up with folks. Anywhere I travel, even if it's outside the United States, I make it a point to meet with activists and organizers and people who are doing this work. So I have to say it's a pleasure to be in a room with you folks. And I want to thank you for inviting me here.